As fighting continues in Gaza, U.S. Democrats have become pretty divided on just how much to support Israel. Many on the left are now openly condemning the Jewish state, calling for the U.S. to withdraw all military aid. What's behind the left's hostility? I'll answer that question and more in tonight's Hold the Line. Welcome to Hold the Line. I'm Buck Sexton. You have continued violence in the Middle East. You have the IDF fighting against Hamas, continuing to try to stop the rocket barrages, go after Hamas infrastructure, and shoot to stop the threat. That's the basic idea behind what Israel is doing here. Prevent the continued acts of terror, the continued war crimes of Hamas, firing rockets intentionally into civilian areas without any designation of this being a military target whatsoever. They're trying to kill men, women, children, the elderly. Israel will not stand for this. No nation would stand for this. And yet there seems to be some degree of confusion on the left, some degree of moral equivalency that is going on here. Sure, Israel has a right to defend itself, but does it have to defend itself this much? Sure, the Israelis have a right to hit back, but wouldn't things be better off if Hamas was closer, had near military parity with Israel? This is the thinking, the very bad, very wrong thinking of so many on the left these days. Here's an example of saying it out loud on TV, MSNBC's Chris Hayes.
The Iron Dome has worked quite well. Today, some got through. I think two Thai nationals, Israeli, died as a result. But I look at those images and I think, well, good. That's good. I'm glad that those rockets are being intercepted. And I also, there's some part of me that's like, can we get an Iron Dome for Gaza? Can the American taxpayer foot the bill to protect innocent children in Gaza, where there's 2 million people in one of the most densely populated parts of the world, so that they don't have death rain down upon them?
Now, I understand that Chris Hayes has no knowledge whatsoever about the military, tactics, guns, missiles, anything, but he's paid on TV to share his opinion, so that's what he's doing as a newsman. But the problem is not that Israel has an Iron Dome and Hamas doesn't. The problem is that Israel has to have an Iron Dome because Hamas refuses to live in peace beside the state of Israel, and so Israel must respond with military force to neutralize the threat. And if Hamas was in a position to stop those reprisals from Israel, to stop those counterstrikes, the conflict would only get worse, because then there wouldn't be any consequence, nor would there be any quick way to stop Hamas from firing thousands of rockets into civilian areas as a continued war crime. But there's, on the military side, there's a lot of confusion on the left because many of them just don't know what the heck they're talking about. On the political side of things, you start to see more of the same narrative that's been there in the past, but perhaps a bit louder this time around. They're more clear in how they will speak about it, that somehow the problem of the Palestinians in Gaza is just has a direct correlation to, has some tie to the problem of Ferguson, Missouri and police brutality, or to the American civil rights struggle, or to the fight against white supremacist systemic racism in this country. Major leaps, but they're being made all the time. In fact, comparisons between the Black Lives Matter movement and the situation with the Palestinians of Gaza is explicitly made by some on TV. Here's Rashid Khalidi.
I think that you have changes that are going on. Things like the Tulsa riots, things like Black Lives Matter, are seen as connected by a very large number of people, not just in the Democratic Party, but particularly young people on campuses, young people all over the country. And I think this is something that's actually happening not just in the United States. There's a lot of pushback. There will be even more pushback. But I think people are moving in the direction of understanding that many of these bromides, Israel has a right to defend itself. Well, do Palestinians have a right to defend themselves? Israel's security. The most insecure people in Palestine and Israel are Palestinians, and we talk about Israel's security.
So much blather here. Just to take some of the nonsense apart, Israel has a right to defend itself, against Palestinian Hamas aggression and attacks. If Hamas didn't attack Israel, there would be no Israel taking military action against Hamas. This is very straightforward, right? But yeah, they try to muddy the waters here, make it seem like it's a much more complicated situation in that regard than it actually is. But then also the connection between BLM and Palestinians, what exactly is that connection? The Israelis have been dealing with multiple efforts for the last 100 years by Arab Muslim states to eradicate them, to annihilate them. The Mufti of Jerusalem was a friend of Hitler and the Nazis, as you recall. There's a very, very nasty history of this region that doesn't often get talked about in the media. But now we're just supposed to believe, because there's some kind of disparity of military arms between the Israelis and Palestinians, there's inherently an injustice being done here. Which society is producing a more decent life, a more just, fair, reasonable outcome for its people? Israel or Gaza and the West Bank? Which society celebrates death, actually has a cult of martyrdom? That would be Palestinian society, not Israeli society. You start to look at what's actually going on over there and why Hamas would be the government, say, of Gaza, and you see that so much of the left-wing rhetoric falls apart with just the lightest touch. All you have to do is see for yourself what's happening. Pay attention to what's going on, and the things that you're told don't make sense anymore. But the left continues to say this. The Democrats in this country believe that there's an oppression, a victimology narrative for the Palestinian people that is absolutely central. Here is Congresswoman Jayapal.
Well, we condemn Hamas's firing of those rockets, but I think you have to look at what prompted even that behavior. I think there was, the continuing annexation that Israel has been undertaking for years, actually. This has been a pattern of action from Israel that frankly has taken away the idea even of a two-state solution, has led to increased hopelessness from the Palestinian people. And I think what Hamas has done is, obviously we condemn that, but we have to look at the power balance here, or imbalance as it were, and we have to put more responsibility on Israel.
What? We have to look at the power balance and put more responsibility on Israel? Israel's more responsible all the time. If Israel took the approach of Hamas, Israel would wipe out all of Gaza, destroy all the buildings, and kill all of the residents there, because that is what Hamas wants to do to Israel. There is inherently greater responsibility being showed by the Israeli IDF and the Israeli government to anything that you would see from Hamas in day-to-day life and in conflicts like this. But yet, the I support Israel but construction from Democrats, the usual quisling on the one hand, on the other, trying to play it for both sides, have it both ways, exactly as the Democrats are on so many issues. Here's Dick Durbin. He supports Israel, but not that dastardly Netanyahu guy.
First, I couldn't disagree more with the policies of Bibi Netanyahu when it comes to the treatment of Palestinians and the establishment of settlements. I think the two-state solution is the only realistic future in that part of the world, and the abandonment of that approach by Netanyahu and his followers, I don't believe is constructive, and I think has added to the tension and stress between Israel and the Palestinians. That's the reality, and I am certainly not going to endorse Netanyahu. Now, let me add very quickly, I made a commitment early in my career that I'm standing by. I am going to support the survival of Israel. Those who want to cut back on the protective missiles and such that they need, I don't join in that.
Yeah, there you have it. Says just enough so that the AOC Marxist wing of the Democrat Party will have something that they can hear that they like. Netanyahu's really bad, but then it's, I support Israel. Why can't you just say the last part? What's with all the nonsense before it? All right, after the break, we'll have more on the conflict in Israel and the Democrat response to it, ideologically and otherwise, with the editor of the Allgemeiner, David Efun. I've been telling you for a while now about online thieves who can easily steal your home's title. But you don't have to take my word for it. Take it from this thief who stole over 150 homes and was sentenced to 25 years in prison. This is why you need Home Title Lock.
Nobody thinks that I can take their house and borrow against the house. No, I have title insurance for that. No, it's in my name, or he would have to get some special document. They would call me. Nobody's calling you. After I've stolen the title, borrowed against it, or sold the property, or done whatever I've done with it, it's 60 to 90 days to even figure out that they're the victim of this crime. By that point, you start getting foreclosure notices, and you realize you've got 4 mortgages on your house. Not only that, you don't even own your home anymore. It's not even in your name.
Heard enough? Don't let this crime happen to you. Go to HomeTitleLock.com and register your address to see if you're already a victim, and enter code RADIO for 30 free days of protection. That's code RADIO at HomeTitleLock.com. Tensions in the Middle East, hate crimes here at home as the latest round of fighting between Israel and the terror group Hamas gets into its second week here. Where does it end? Here to discuss where we are with all this is the editor at the Allgemeiner, David Efun. David, as always, good to see you.
Likewise, Buck.
Just, if you would, bring us up to speed on where we are right now with the conflict, with the IDF response to Hamas rocket attacks. What is the current situation on the ground?
Well, you're talking about over 4,000 rockets that have now been fired by the terrorist-controlled Gaza enclave, which is adjacent to Israel, to the southwest of the country. Israeli citizens have been under fire, running to bomb shelters, and the Israeli military, the IDF, has been responding by targeting terrorist infrastructure, terror leaders, rocket launch sites, munitions, and similar targets, underground tunnels, and other terror infrastructure in the Gaza Strip over the last 11 days. It does seem, even though quite recently there was a major barrage of rocket fire coming out of Gaza, Israel's Security Cabinet is meeting as we speak to discuss propositions for a ceasefire and the potential to ratchet things down after a pretty tense 11 days there in Israel and the Gaza Strip.
What are some of the conditions that would have to be met and some of the guarantees for sustainability for a ceasefire like this, should it come soon, David?
Well, from the Israeli side, what they're looking to establish is deterrence. Obviously, their first and goal is to secure the safety of their civilians, citizens who live in the Gaza envelope, but also far beyond that, to allow smooth operation of the economy. And, we're talking about 11 people killed in Israel, so including a young child, the age of 5, tragically. So Israel's going to want to make sure that it's caused enough damage to Hamas infrastructure in the Gaza Strip that they're going to think twice and 3 times before initiating this kind of attack in the future.
And what are your thoughts about how the Biden administration has handled this so far? It's the first really imminent national security challenge abroad that has gotten a lot of scrutiny when it comes to Biden's leadership early on. Saying the right things, doing the right things, or not?
There were some of the right things that were done. I mean, in a general sense, there was support for Israel in what it needed to do and in its self-defense campaign. Certainly also the Biden administration blocked the United Nations Security Council resolution that was aimed at censuring Israel. On the other hand, you do see pressure coming from the White House towards the ceasefire, and you see a decent amount of moral equivocation in terms of how they're addressing the various actors as being in some ways parallel. So let's just say on the whole it's good support, but certainly not what it was in the past under the Trump administration, where you had this sort of full-throated support, not just verbally, but saying to Israel, you guys do what you're going to do. We know and trust you to know what's in your best interest. You don't have this sort of prescriptive effort to pressure Israel into taking a certain approach that we're seeing now from the Biden administration.
There's also been footage, David, of assaults that have been making the rounds far outside this theater of operations of Israel and Gaza. You had in Los Angeles, there's video we could show everybody at home of pro-Palestine activists getting into a a physical altercation attacking pro-Israeli demonstrators, attacking Jews. Is this just now the nature of this situation? Once you leave even the region, there are these factions, almost violent militant factions that pop up even in the West.
Yeah, I mean, Palestinian activists are very fond of saying, this isn't about Jews, it's just about Israel. But, as Congressman Richie Torres said recently in an interview, that if you look at the tenor and the tone of these actions and rallies we're seeing around the world, this doesn't feel like criticism. This feels like hatred. Palestinian circles, pro-Palestinian circles, are replete with overt Jew hatred, whether it's swastikas appearing in combination with Palestinian flags and Free Palestine graffiti, but certainly physical attacks on Jewish people and Jewish targets around the world are rampant. The major Jewish security group in the UK reported a 438% increase in anti-Semitic attacks and crimes during this period. So there's a lot of work to be done for those that ostensibly carry the banner of Palestinian solidarity to show that they themselves are not falling into the trap of bigotry and turning their frustrations against Jewish individuals and Jewish institutions around the world. Obviously, that's unacceptable. And really, they're not doing a very good job in proving their claim that this is just about Israel. It's not about Jews. In fact, they're affirming the contrary narrative, the way things are standing right now.
David, why is it that the American left, I know this is a complicated subject that we could go on at some length about, and it's the last thing I'm asking you here as we sit to update our audience on what's going on, but why does the left, particularly the hard left, the Marxist leftists in America, feel such solidarity and such a connection with not just the Palestinian people, but even in many cases with Hamas itself?
I mean, it's incredible. It boggles the mind. People like, Bella and Gigi Hadid, for example, who would probably be stoned if they stepped foot into Gaza, dressing the way that they tend to dress. And certainly when it comes to gay rights and women's rights, this is not a liberal society. This is not a progressive society. This is not a society that associates in any way, shape, or form with what you might consider progressive ideology, except this sort of common denominator, the hatred of the Jewish state and the hatred of Israel. So, unfortunately, what we've seen time and time again is that, logic can really go out of the window when it comes to that shared hatred. We've seen the far right and the far left. I mentioned swastikas and Palestinian flags appearing together at rallies on multiple occasions. The far left and the far right starts to meet when you go far enough. So, this is something that progressive groups need to take seriously and understand the full extent and the scope of the slippery path that they're walking down. I think I mentioned Richie Torres earlier. That's a progressive congressman who sits in the district right next door to AOC's district, and he's an incredible supporter of Israel. People have to understand that despite the efforts by various lobby and interest groups to connect these two ideologies together, the truth is, if you look at what they really represent, nothing could be further from the truth. Support for Israel as it is and should be part of progressive ideology, as it should be part of Americanism and really a worldview that America espouses that fights for individual rights, liberties, freedoms, and obviously that's what Israel stands for, and that's definitely not what Hamas in Gaza stands for.
David Afun of the Allgemeiner. David, always good to see you. Thanks for your expertise.
Pleasure, Buck.
While the conflict in Israel is getting headlines, Joe Biden is turning his attention to Asia. He's set to meet with South Korean President Moon Jae-in tomorrow. After the break, we'll talk to former CIA Deputy Division Chief Bruce Klingner about what to expect from this summit and what's going on with Biden and the whole Far East. Stay with us. I want all of you to go to this website right now, preparewiththefirst.com. It's a special website set up by our friends at My Patriot Supply. Every day it seems like things are getting worse out there. The best way to have peace of mind is to stockpile emergency food and water. My Patriot Supply is America's leading preparedness company, and they're here to help you become self-reliant, no matter what happens next. But you can't wait for something bad to happen, then react. You need to act now, before we see a stock market crash, hyperinflation, civil unrest, or a major natural disaster. My Patriot Supply has been in business for over a dozen years, serving millions of families and earning 39,000 4-star and 5-star reviews. Their food is specially packaged to stay fresh for up to 25 years, so when you prepare today, it'll be there for you when you need it. Right now, save $50 on their 4-week emergency food kit at preparewiththefirst.com. The meals are delicious and provide 2,000 calories per day. No other brand comes close. That's Prepare.
For decades, the United States has underwritten international maritime security. We and our partners have kept the sea lanes open and secure. We developed clear rules of the road, but as you know, increasingly, we're seeing those rules challenged, both by the rapid advance of technology and the disruptive actions of nations like China and Russia.
President Joe Biden yesterday during his commencement address at the U.S. Coast Guard Academy. As China's economic fortunes have risen over the past several decades, so too has its belligerence toward the U.S. Among other issues, the Chinese Communist Party continues to threaten the freedom of navigation not only in its own territorial sea, but in those of its neighbors. It also continues to prop up the Kim regime in North Korea, which remains a threat to regional stability. Tomorrow, President Biden will meet with South Korean President Moon Jae-in, a key strategic partner in the region. So what should we expect from the forthcoming summit? Joining us now to give us perspective is former CIA Deputy Division Chief for Korea, Senior Research Fellow at the Heritage Foundation, Bruce Klingner. Bruce, good to see you. Thanks so much for joining us.
Well, thanks for having me back.
First, just tell me what's going to be top of the agenda from what you can gather here for Presidents Biden and Moon and their meeting?
Well, North Korea is always going to push itself to the top whenever a U.S. and South Korean president get together. We have a critically important ally in South Korea, but there are differences between the two countries. President Moon is a liberal or a progressive and is pushing for a more benevolent policy towards North Korea, wanting to front load a lot of benefits to try to get North Korea to behave itself by offering it rewards ahead of time. The U.S. still sees the need for pressure and maintaining the denuclearization as an end goal. And so there are differences. So President Moon is looking for relaxation of sanctions, and the U.S. doesn't want to do that.
What did the situation, how did the situation change over the 4 years of Trump administration policy to North Korea, and where does that leave things now at the start of the Biden administration?
Well, as with every U.S. administration, Washington tried to engage North Korea with negotiations. President Trump tried a different top-down approach of having summit meetings rather than the more traditional bottom-up where you insist on progress and diplomatic negotiations before you have a summit. But North Korea continued to build and expand and refine its nuclear and missile arsenal, engaged in a lot of missile expositions and parades and flights. So we've seen that North Korea improved its ICBM capabilities. It can now hit the entire continental U.S. with nuclear weapons, including hydrogen bombs, not just atomic bombs. And it's revealed a lot of different tactical level missiles that directly threaten U.S. forces in Korea and Japan, as well as our allies.
And now that we are focusing a bit more also on the Chinese relationship to the U.S. and the differing approach from the Biden administration, how does South Korea play a role in that? What are we looking for from the South Koreans when dealing with the Chinese Communist Party?
We're looking for South Korea to do more. Last month, the Japanese Prime Minister met with President Biden and really set the bar high for an ally, calling out really in explicit terms Chinese transgressions in the East and South China Sea, the belligerent attitudes towards the countries there, as well as criticizing Chinese human rights in Hong Kong and against the Uyghur minority. and also intimidating Taiwan. So that really set the bar high for what we would like President Moon to do. But I don't think he's going to meet that bar, because South Korea, even before the Moon administration, was very reluctant to criticize China, which is its largest trading partner. They fear economic retribution if they too strongly criticize Beijing.
And do you think that the recent statements from people like Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, about a possible boycott of the Beijing Olympics, do you put stock in that? Do you think they may actually be willing to push for real action against China?
Well, there's a call not only for boycotting it, but actually postponing it and having another country do it. So we're pushing back against the human rights violations that China has engaged in, really genocide against the Uyghur Muslim minority in Xinjiang province. So there's a lot of different legislative proposals or executive proposals for getting tough on China, and I think a lot of issues that perhaps were in the or in the background to people that don't follow Asian issues every day really have now come to the forefront, because everyone is collectively very angry at China for its lack of action on COVID initially, and then covering up the virus.
There was some reporting this week in the New York Times about China mandating the storage of a whole lot of data from customers that are using the App Store from Apple in China, which they also allow the Chinese government to determine what apps can't be shared that would normally be in the App Store. How much do you think of a cyber issue are we going to be able to make of this, not just for the private sector, but also at the government level going forward? I mean, is there an awakening, you think, now to China as a corporate bad actor that stretches all over the world? What would you advise the Biden administration to do about this?
China, along with Russia and North Korea, are really the top three cyber threats. We've seen malware and cyber attacks by all three nations. And then China has really been engaged in a lot of illegal and intimidating business practices, forcing U.S. and other companies to give up intellectual property rights for the right to sell in China. So across the board, really, we need a comprehensive strategy against China, not only on the military front, but also on the economic front and increasingly in the cyber front.
What levers do we have to try to bring the CCP in line with not being necessarily even a good actor, but just less of a destructive one in some of these areas like intellectual property theft, things that the Trump administration certainly talked about a lot and led to some tariffs? Does the Biden administration have tools they could use but are shy about using at this point? Are they backing off of some of the more confrontational posture of the administration before? How do you see that shaping up?
Well, there are things just in the North Korea area. There's a lot of sanctions and enforcing of U.S. laws that we haven't done against Chinese violators, Chinese banks and businesses that have enabled North Korea to violate UN sanctions and U.S. laws. We've been pulling our punches against even enforcing our own laws through successive U.S. administrations. Also, the Biden administration is going to try multilateralism. There's a quadrilateral security dialogue, or the Quad, which has been around for a while, but only really reinvigorated in the last couple of years. So we're trying to use like-minded democracies in Asia to call out China, to step up against China when they do either intimidating military or diplomatic tactics or engage in unfair business practices.
Bruce Klingner, thanks so much. Appreciate your expertise. Good to see you.
Great. Thanks for having me.
Bitcoin has had a rocky ride over the past few weeks as tweets by Tesla CEO Elon Musk have caused the cryptocurrency to fluctuate in value. After the break, tech reporter Naomi Brockwell explains the drama, the up and downs of the crypto market. Elon Musk made a big splash in February when it was announced the electric car manufacturer Tesla had purchased $1.5 billion in Bitcoin and would be accepting the cryptocurrency as payment for its vehicles, making it the first Fortune 500 company to do so. The announcement led to a months-long bull run for Bitcoin, which reached an all-time high of almost $65,000. Fast forward a few months, and the bloom feels like it might be off the rose a little bit. Last week, Musk sent a shockwave through the crypto market, tweeting, Tesla has suspended vehicle purchases using Bitcoin. We are concerned about rapidly increasing use of fossil fuels for Bitcoin mining and transactions, especially coal, which has the worst emissions of any fuel. He added, cryptocurrency is a good idea on many levels, and we believe it has a promising future, but this cannot come at great cost to the environment. Bitcoin's price began tumbling almost immediately. So is the writing on the wall for the burgeoning crypto market, or is this just a bump in the road? Joining me now is tech journalist for NBTV and the host of CoinDesk's The Hash, Naomi Brockwell. Naomi, thanks so much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Let's just start with the environmental factors here, those concerns over Bitcoin mining. Can you explain what the concern is and also tell us whether it's overblown?
Sure thing. So if you read between the lines about Elon Musk's announcement, it turns out that on the same day he announces that Tesla is no longer accepting Bitcoin payments, Tesla is also applying for renewable energy credits. So this seems to me to be a lot more about a PR stunt and appeasing the correct governmental institutions than anything to do with Bitcoin being havoc on the environment. If you actually look at Bitcoin production, 45% of Bitcoin energy is derived from renewable sources, and then three-quarters of miners actually use renewables in their mix as well. I think what a lot of people don't realize about the energy debate around Bitcoin is that it's not like when you feed a city and you have to have the electrical source close to the city. Bitcoin miners can go wherever energy is cheapest, wherever it's most abundant. So what you see is that actually you're gathering around areas, for example, in Sichuan, where you have 2 times as much energy produced from hydropower they can actually fit in their dams. That's a hotbed for crypto mining. So it's places like that that are actually benefiting because Bitcoin miners are taking energy off their hands. In New Hampshire, you have power plants, you have nuclear power plants that are producing too much energy. And so they're going to have to do something about all of the energy they're producing because they can't just turn off those plants, right, when the grid gets full. So cryptocurrency can actually become very useful for that in terms of mining.
Are there other cryptocurrencies that aren't as energy intensive and perhaps use that, other than Bitcoin, and use that as now an advantage to try to push themselves as an alternative? How, crypto, or Bitcoin rather, is what, close to $1 trillion market value, and so there could be some others that want to be competitors. Are they trying to use the energy question to gain an advantage here?
I think there are definitely some cryptocurrencies and communities rallying around these cryptocurrencies that are trying to push that. There are different ways that cryptocurrencies achieve consensus. It gets very technical very quickly, but basically proof of work uses a lot of computational power, but then you have this thing called proof of stake. Now, everyone's heard of Ethereum at this stage, and they're trying to transition over to a proof of stake model. The idea being that they would consume less energy. But just rewinding a little bit on that note, this energy debate, it always strikes me as odd because it's like people are considering cryptocurrency to be this extraneous thing and it's unnecessary and it's using this energy. And they're not quite realizing the value that cryptocurrency is giving the world. They're giving the world uncensorable money. They're giving the world the power of financial sovereignty. Now, perhaps in the United States, where people are more comfortable with their government, maybe they're okay with not having financial sovereignty. Maybe they're okay with getting the bank's permission every time they want to make a purchase. But if you're in Venezuela and all of your money is locked up in a financial system that you can't access, you're losing all of your savings. It's being hyperinflated away. If you're in China and you're trying to access medicine or your clothing, and these are things that the government has decided, well, maybe you can't have access to it. Maybe your social credit rating isn't good enough and you can't participate in certain marketplaces. Cryptocurrency becomes incredibly valuable for giving these people freedoms. So I don't think it's a matter of saying, well, it uses energy, therefore it should be shut down. Hospitals use energy. Everything that is valuable basically uses energy. So it's like a strange debate where people aren't saying, well, how much much does the traditional financial system use in terms of energy? They probably use the amount of a small country as well, only they're also, inflating away our currency, and I think the cryptocurrency is more valuable in that regard.
In that vein, what do you see happening with crypto right now as it pertains to, or as it relates to, the trillions of dollars that the U.S. government, for example, is spending in excess of the trillions that it was already planning to, and very quickly will be coming upon 30 trillion in debt for one country? Is that, in your mind, pushing a lot of the crypto adoption that we're seeing around the world, or is it just more a function of broader understanding of this and general, things like Tesla's usage of it?
It's absolutely no coincidence that we've seen this giant bull run right when the government is printing all of this money. If we look at why Bitcoin was created, it was created in the aftermath of the 2008 crisis, when you had all of these bailouts for big banks and you had politicians filling their pockets, and we had TARP bailouts that were never even able to be scrutinized, right? They're completely opaque. We don't even know where that money went. And basically, this cypherpunk community decided, well, we need a money that's outside of this system. We don't want our money to be inflated away if the government, decides that they like the taste of all of this money printing and they want to continue. We don't want to become like Argentina or Venezuela. And so they created a money that wasn't controlled by elites in power. It was an open system. It was controlled by mathematics, not people who are corruptible or persuadable or who are fallible. And so now fast forward, and we're printing so much money right now. If you compare it to what happened in 2008, what's happening now is absolutely unprecedented. It's orders of magnitude more than what we were seeing in 2008. And we're starting to see the effects of it. We got the inflation numbers come out last week. The consumer price index is saying that it's over 4% inflation, which is more than they thought, than they expected. But if you ask most economists, they're saying the actual inflation number is probably a lot higher than that. So then you have companies like MicroStrategy saying, well, actually, we think that Bitcoin is going to be a better store of value for our Treasury reserve assets than holding it in cash, because we see the value of our cash disappearing year after year. And so a lot of companies are realizing that Bitcoin could be a better store of value than cash, and that relying on mathematics may be better than relying on bureaucrats.
Naomi, we're going to have you back to talk about Dogecoin and a whole bunch of other things. But for now, we really appreciate your insight, and thank you so much for joining us. We'll be right back with Quick Hits. We're living in very uncertain times, and being prepared for the unknown is more important than ever. I'm sure you've noticed the world we live in today is anything but predictable. The government is passing massive spending bills, the Federal Reserve is printing trillions of dollars in fiat currency, and many experts are predicting inflation could run rampant in the coming months. That could spell disaster for the dollars in your bank account. And we could all benefit from something a little more reliable right about now. Well, what could be more reliable than real gold and silver? I'm talking about real gold and silver you can actually hold right in your hands. Call the Oxford Gold Group right now and learn how easy it is to get real gold and silver sent securely directly to your home, or how you can have real gold and silver placed in your IRA or 401k. Just call the Oxford Gold Group at 833-600-GOLD and ask for your free guide on owning gold and silver. Again, call the Oxford Gold Group right now, 833-600-GOLD. The Cuomo brothers are in the hot seat again, and Chicago Mayor Lori Lightfoot gets a taste of her own medicine. Those stories on Quick Hits tonight. Let's jump right into it. Very interesting. As you know, Governor Cuomo has had a very bad 6 months or so after having had what was perhaps his most popular and promising 6 months in office during the early days of the pandemic. Well, it turns out that CNN's Chris Cuomo was advising his brother during the harassment allegations against him. Now, let me say this. I'm a family-first person. So would I help my brothers or my sister under a similar circumstance? Absolutely, I would. And I think that that's just an obligation of honor to your own family. That said, if I were a newsman over at CNN with my own show in primetime, or at least they call it primetime, Cuomo primetime, I would have a problem presenting myself as a journalist who does things with no fear or favor when I'm actually helping run propaganda operations behind the scenes for my brother, the governor of New York, who's been accused many times over of sexual harassment. That's just another moment in time here where we have to say, so the Cuomos A lot of dishonesty there, a lot of bad stuff, a lot of reason to question the Cuomo brand in general going forward. Something else that I've been wondering about. You know how they've got kids masked up right now, which I believe is child abuse, and this should stop right away. It never should have happened, so it certainly should end as soon as is humanly possible. But there are people out there who feel very virtuous about masking up their kids. And people like me will say, but your child is at no risk of dying from COVID, and it's very unlikely to give it to anybody else, even if your child got it. And they say, that's not true. And then they'll put out a number that a few hundred children under the age of 12 have died of COVID in the entire pandemic in the United States. Well, it turns out there are 2 reports right now that suggest that California, at least, greatly inflated COVID-19 numbers among children. Here's what it said. The reported number of COVID hospitalizations was grossly inflated for children in California hospitals, according to 2 research papers. They both were published in the journal Hospital Pediatrics, found that pediatric hospitalizations for COVID-19 were overcounted by at least 40%. So that's right. There was very far off numbers about the risk to children, at least in the state of California, the largest state in the U.S. I'm sure that this is likely to have played out in many other ways in many other places all across the country. So we have to continue to look more closely at the data, because when you have people that will only take off that double mask outside when you can present them with the most obvious of cold hard facts, we have to make sure the data, the facts we're using, are correct. So there was a story earlier in the week that Lori Lightfoot, the mayor of Chicago, was only going to give interviews to Black or brown journalists. And this got a lot of people quite confused and agitated, because that seems like textbook racism. I'm going to give you, because it's a benefit to give a journalist an interview. It's really money and prestige that comes with an interview like that. If you're a local Chicago paper, you get a meeting with the mayor, a sit down with the mayor. That has real value. And there's some obligation, you would think, for a public official to not engage in overt favoritism and to actually be willing to obey or to abide by equal protection under the law as a constitutional principle. Well, Lori Lightfoot won't. She only wants to give interviews to Black or brown journalists by her own office's admission. So a Latino reporter has refused to interview Lori Lightfoot because she declined to get rid of her only interviews from Black and brown journalists policy. So let's give some credit to this reporter. I'm a Latino reporter, Chicago Tribune, whose interview request was granted for today. Gregory Pratt is this fellow's name. However, I asked the mayor's office to lift its condition on others, and when they said no, we respectfully canceled. Politicians don't get to choose who covers them. Now, that's not really the principle that should be forwarded here, which I think is interesting. It should be politicians shouldn't discriminate on the basis of skin color. But it's moving in the right direction from this reporter. He almost got it all right. We'll continue to follow this and more. That's it for tonight's Hold the Line. The No Spin News with Bill O'Reilly is up next. Shields high.